Hello and welcome to Balancing Act, Life and Struggles of a Teenage Girl, a mental health and wellness and semi-unfiltered podcast made for teens by a teen. I'm your host, Morea, a 16-year-old girl from New York, and here on Balancing Act, I bring you weekly episodes featuring relatable conversations, personal stories, and practical insights to help you navigate life's balancing act and related challenges, and to remind you that you are not alone. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Balancing Act, Life and Struggles of a Teenage Girl. So, not too long ago, I was kind of just on the internet, and I'm like, okay, what are good ways of working through depression, anxiety, eating disorders, stuff like that. And then this thing just kept popping up called CBT, and I'm like, what the heck is CBT? And then there was also DBT. And what is this? How does it work? And I was really confused, if I'm going to be completely honest. And so then I did a teeny tiny bit of research and I realized that CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy and DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy. But I still had no clue what the heck these things were. But in this episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Rebecca Skolnick about the basics of cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and exposure therapy. Dr. Skolnick is a co-founder of Mindwell New York City, which is a group psychology practice in New York, and she specializes in using CBT, DBT, and exposure therapy to help people manage anxiety, OCD, phobias, and eating disorders, which is so cool. In this episode, we talk a lot about the basics of CBT, DBT, and exposure therapy for people like me who really haven't heard of these therapies before. But thanks to this interview with her and a teeny tiny bit of background research I did beforehand, I now know a lot more, and I hope that by listening to this episode, you will learn a lot more too. She shares some really great information on what these therapies are. She explains how they're used and a bit of the science behind why they work so well and how there's so much evidence to back them up, which makes them used so frequently, but for some reason, I still hadn't heard of them. She also talks about some really practical skills or techniques that you can use to begin to manage anxiety, phobias, or body image or eating disorders, and it's really cool. So let's dive into it. I am super excited to learn more about CBT and DBT, so thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, just starting off, do you think you could explain a little bit about what CBT and DBT are for people who may have not heard of them or don't know much about what they are?
Absolutely. So CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy and DBT is dialectical behavior therapy. And really, they're both similar in that DBT is a type of behavior therapy. They're both based on research, which is when we say evidence based, we mean there's been research to show that they're effective for specific disorders and issues. They're really short term and focused on the present moment, very collaborative. The therapist and the patient sort of work together and are seen as equals, and they're active forms of therapy. And so people often have practice to do or homework to do in between sessions to really learn how to utilize practical tools that they're getting in their daily lives. More specifically, CBT really talks about the connection between your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So, understanding how all of those things are connected, as well as how to change unhelpful thinking patterns or unhelpful or problematic behaviors, and learning how to manage emotions and cope with difficult emotions. DBT is a sort of third wave approach, we call it, where it combines CBT and more Eastern traditions like mindfulness and acceptance, and is more focused on emotion regulation or how to really manage emotions, decrease vulnerability to emotion, and not let your urges and emotions sort of take over and control all of your behavior.
So, you said for CBT and DBT, you often work with a therapist. And so, what might these sessions look like?
First, you would always have an initial session to get to know each other a bit, and where the therapist is going to ask a lot of questions about your history and about a lot of different issues that might be coming up so that they can really tailor the treatment to you. Because even though there are some workbooks and techniques that are used often, each therapy session is really designed to treat that person. So there's definitely a thorough assessment. You might have to fill out questionnaires. We try to get a lot of data to make sure that we really understand what's going on and tailor the treatment accordingly. And then the sessions usually start with some overview of how are you feeling, not just like how are you feeling today, but what emotion are you feeling? How would you rate it on a scale from 0 to 5 or 0 to 10? And there's sometimes an agenda that's set for the session collaboratively. Like, what do you want to talk about today? Here's what I think might be helpful. And often some tools that you're learning, like a new kind of set of tools, and then a sort of a homework practice to do that's assigned that would be reviewed the next time. It's not always so structured, but it can be. It can follow that structure, or it may be that there's a little more flexibility around that. And there's still a lot of those things are covered. In a DBT session, it's similar, though that we have something called a diary card, which is like a chart that people fill out that where during the week they're rating their urges, their behaviors, their emotions, what skills they've used. And that's used as a tool for them as well as a way to kind of review the week in the beginning of each session and prioritize what we're going to talk about. So that's sort of a general overview. So there's a lot of talking and also teaching.
Is this a kind of reflective therapy, or are you doing things to actively work to shift your mindset? What are common practices that you might see if you start CBT or DBT?
In
Yeah.
CBT, there's a lot of work identifying unhelpful thinking patterns and learning more adaptive ways to think. So, we might notice that someone, for example, is engaging in black and white thinking, where it's like all or nothing. And then we might work with them to learn how to think more flexibly or to see the gray areas, for example. And, we might be working a lot on behavior change. So if someone is afraid of heights, for example, we might work on exposure therapy to doing things that get them higher and higher up and learning how to tolerate their anxiety in those situations and helping their anxiety to go down. We may work on relaxation skills, generally for stress or anxiety. With eating disorders, we might work on actually logging and understanding food patterns and unhelpful thinking patterns and emotions that are contributing to disordered eating and working on those. So there's a lot of different things we could be doing. With DVT, there are specific sets of skills that are taught, usually in the format of a group. And also, then in the individual therapy, they're more specifically applied to that person. So, those are skills for mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness.
Okay, so CBT and DBT are so complex, but it seems like, at least what I'm kind of getting, is that the difference that cognitive behavioral therapy is more about like regulating thought patterns, and DBT is more about like emotions.
Yeah, I'd say that's generally true. We often incorporate CBT into DBT. So I would say DBT is a more intensive treatment because it definitely focuses on emotion regulation, as you said. And it brings in sometimes techniques from CBT or sometimes working on the unhelpful thinking pattern, a lot of behavioral techniques as well. So the B in both of them. There's a lot of overlap with exposure and learning how to decrease behaviors that you want to decrease and increase behaviors you want to increase. So there's definitely overlap, but yes, DBT is really more about the emotion regulation.
And so, in terms of how effective these therapies are, because I know a lot of people might be like skeptical and like, oh, well, talking about my emotions and getting more in touch with my emotions and my thought patterns really helped me. So, how effective have these practices been? And what advice would you have for people who may be skeptical of giving this a shot if they have anxiety or depression or something else that CBT and DBT can be used to treat?
So I think it's healthy to be skeptical sometimes, and that makes sense. I mean, these are called evidence based treatments because they're based in research. So you can look up studies on them. You can ask for resources with studies showing they're effective for various disorders, like you mentioned. I think sometimes people are worried that they don't go deep enough and things like that. But I would argue that talking about your core beliefs about yourself, about the world, about others is pretty deep. And it's true that it's not as much of an insight oriented therapy where we're just sort of learning about yourself and talking about your past and your childhood. It is more practical and more about changing things now that are not helpful. We may talk about the past, but that's not going to be the main focus. So I would say it's not for everybody. It depends what you're looking for. But if you really want to change your behavior or do things differently or think differently, then CBT or DBT could be really helpful. The tools too, especially like the DBT skills, if you've never learned or had an opportunity to practice, these are really life skills. These are skills that help you do lots of things and they help lots of people. And most people use them even if they haven't been in DBT. So I would say, we know that these are effective tools, both because we've seen in research studies that they help people to decrease their dysregulation and their problematic behaviors as well as because we've seen in real life that these things are helpful. So I would say maybe try to read or learn more and see if you're someone who likes tools and having goals and working toward goals, if these approaches might be for you.
Yeah, it seems like you're saying CBT and DBT are much more focused on the present moment than about the past or the future. So I guess if you're someone who has something that you really want to tackle, like a fear of something, because they can be used to treat phobias, then this might be a really effective way to manage that instead of talking about what may have led up to it, because that may not be as helpful if you're trying to make a change in the present moment. Do you think you could give a few examples of techniques that listeners could use today for, let's say, somebody struggles with anxiety? Are there any specific techniques that you would use in CBT or DBT to help them in moments where they're feeling anxious about something, maybe going down that worst case scenario mindset?
Yeah. So, of course, in therapy, it's specific and individualized, but I would say generally with anxiety. So, if you're someone who tends to have those worst case scenario thoughts, or it's almost like a mental habit that you just think of the worst thing, it can be helpful to, first of all, note that, like, okay, there goes my mind again, going to the worst case scenario. That's something I do, not to judge it, just to notice it. And then it can be helpful to turn your worries into predictions to sort of say, okay, well, what am I predicting here? Like, what is the worst case scenario I'm predicting? Check the facts. What are facts that I know? And based on what you know, how likely is it that this prediction is going to happen? Because sometimes bad things do happen. It's not like every worry is not true. A lot of the time, when someone tends to worry more and more, that the worries don't come true, but we want to evaluate it, like sort of become a scientist for yourself and say, okay, well, what are the facts? What am I predicting? How likely is it? And then what is the most likely scenario based on this, right? Like do I know like will actually be more likely? And then what's the best case scenario? Because a lot of the time with anxiety, we don't think about that. We think go straight to the worst. And so it's like, well, what's actually best case too? Not saying that's going to happen, but let's say just so we know what's the best case, what's the worst case, what's the most likely. And if the worst case happens, how would I cope with it? So, kind of going through like, how would you manage it? Because a lot of the time there's catastrophizing where people with anxiety think it's like the end of the world if X, Y, or Z happens. And sometimes things happen. So, how can you cope and not be the end of the world, even if it's really hard? That'd be one example. We also work a lot with relaxation techniques like progressive muscle relaxation or using imagery, and mindfulness can be helpful for grounding exercises like looking for three things around you, listening for three sounds, feeling three things, or even just focusing on your breath and taking slow, deep diaphragmatic belly breath. That can be really helpful. It can also help to sometimes distract yourself or find ways to learn how to distract when it's not a good time to be thinking about whatever the thing is that you're worried about. So, just finding little ways to distract yourself. Those would be some quick tips.
Yeah, it seems like these are really great tips and things that I've tried in the past, but I feel like some people are skeptical of like, "Oh, will deep breathing really help me?" And I'm one of those people who has like tried these and then still a little bit on the skeptical part, but I'm trying to be more open. So what impact have you seen that these skills have on real people, maybe yourself or just the people that you've worked with?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think a lot of people do say that with the breathing, like, oh, just breathe. And that's not going to change everything. So that's one small tool to help your body to learn how to relax a little bit. But you're right that it takes a lot more than just these two. And what we've seen is that that's sometimes a good introduction to learning how to identify what you're feeling and then have some way to change it. But what I've seen and what I've experienced myself is really what helps with change is changing behavior. So when I was growing up, I was a lot more anxious about social situations and especially being evaluated. I had a lot of test anxiety. If I had an interview for something, I would be really anxious. I would definitely be anxious in this scenario, being interviewed on a podcast or even just speaking in front of people, presenting. And techniques like breathing regularly and doing relaxation exercises at night would help me to go to sleep or to help me to not get my anxiety to a level that was really uncomfortable. However, what really helped me ultimately was doing it, and doing exposure to these scenarios, talking to people, putting myself out there. It's still even a little hard. And, I'm a lot more comfortable because I've done it so many times now. I don't take tests so much anymore, but after years and years of school, you learn how to take tests. And I might do some breathing right before an exam and some encouraging statements reminding myself, like, I've got this, I can do this, or some of that talking through, the worst case scenario, best case scenario situation. And, just the experience of doing it over and over and over is really helpful. And I do a lot of work with people who have fears and things they're avoiding. And when they really get better is when they start to face those fears and do the things they're avoiding. And sometimes having these tools helps them to get there or it helps them to get through those situations. So it's definitely much more than just taking a deep breath. And I get that that might sound like a little too simplified for what's really going on.
These skills are really like taking a deep breath is really just a stepping stone to so many other skills and exposure to what you're afraid of. So, when you're talking about like fears and people using exposure therapy to deal with fears they may have, that reminded me a lot of maybe eating disorders and people who have a fear of eating certain foods. And I know that CBT and DBT can be used to treat eating disorders. So, what are some CBT and DBT techniques specifically that might be used to help treat eating disorders, considering that exposure therapy is also part of CBT?
Yeah, so sometimes exposure is used to treat eating disorders for what you're describing, where there's fear of foods and working your way up to eating different foods that you might be fearing. It may also be exposure to breaking food rules. A lot of the time with eating disorders, people have a lot of rules about what they eat, when they eat, how they eat, all these different rules. And so it might be working on breaking those and increasing flexibility around thinking about eating and eating. We also use exposure for body image work. So sometimes we do what's called mirror exposure, where people learn how to look in a full length mirror, look at themselves without judgment, and using more mindfulness to observe and describe their body from head to toe without zooming in on the areas they don't like and without using any positive or negative words, but really just more objective in order to help break those connections between negative thoughts and judgments and looking at your body. So we do incorporate exposure. That's not the only piece, but that would be one piece of the truth.
Wow, that's so interesting what you just said about body image and how you would look in the mirror to cope with body image by not saying negative things and just being a little bit more neutral about your body because I know, at least for me and like what I've been told, it's like, oh, you're having a bad body image day. Well, stop body checking, stop looking in the mirror. But I guess actually exposing yourself to it and shifting your mindset can be so effective. So, what's the science behind shifting your mindset? Because I know there's stuff about neural pathways and how when you keep doing certain behaviors, that reinforces it. So, what's the science behind exposure therapy and how doing something that you're afraid of would help you to no longer be as afraid of it?
Yes, this really goes back to animal experiments. Pavlov and Skinner, and they were the origins of behavior therapy and exposure therapy, specifically Pavlov. So basically, what happens with these fears is that we become classically conditioned to be afraid of things that may not actually be dangerous. And that can happen with our bodies too. So it might be that you so many times thought negative thoughts when you looked at a certain area of your body or when you even see a mirror, that your body and your brain learn that this is dangerous, bad, don't do it. And so when we're doing exposure or we're talking about these things, we're really trying to break those associations and learn that like it's actually okay. And these can be neutral or they may not be as scary as they seem. And we want to get rid of the negative part. So, with a phobia, sort of a simple way to look at it, if somebody is afraid of heights, let's say, and they gradually work their way up to going higher and higher and spending more time up high, like on a bridge or an airplane, whatever it is, they're teaching their brain that it's okay, nothing bad happening, and they can do it. And your body learns how to sit with that level of anxiety and tolerate it. And there's like new learning that occurs that ends up helping your brain to create new associations. Like now you have these positive experiences or these experiences where you were able to conquer things, like mastery experiences. And that really helps you to then continue to do those things. So that's part of the science behind exposure. Sometimes changing behavior, then really behavior is governed by what happens after. So it can feel really reinforcing to do these things that are hard.
It's so cool how, like, we're animals, well, like, 'cause we're humans, but, like, we're part of, like, the animal kingdom, and so much about, like, the way animals operate is tied to the way we operate, and how we're conditioning ourselves to do certain things, and then by conditioning ourselves to rethink that or to do something else, like, just how much that can change the way we act, and I guess some people might be skeptical about trying something because they're like, "Oh, will it really change my behavior?" But it seems like there's such a scientific base to all of this and, like, CBT and DBT and everything, and that it is so effective, and that's why it's one of the therapies that is often turned to when people have anxiety, OCD, depression, phobias. So, I know that another barrier that would prevent people from reaching therapy besides being skeptical about it is that therapy can be extremely expensive, and a lot of people don't think that it's worth spending all of this money on, especially if they feel like they have other more pressing financial concerns. So, are there any resources that you would recommend for getting in CBT or DBT practices if you're someone with limited money to spend on therapy?
Yes, it is tricky and it's a real problem. I would say there are a few things. So, one is you can look at hospital based clinics or graduate school based clinics, where in graduate school, there's often trainees who are working under a supervisor who's licensed, and the fees can definitely be more affordable. For example, where I went to graduate school at Hofstra, and they have a great outpatient clinic that uses CBT and DBT and evidence based treatments and low cost and good quality. And you can go to a hospital based clinic that might have, if you ask specifically for CBT or DBT, they may have that. There are certain hospitals like Northwell has really great CBT and DBT programs. So you kind of have to look for those specific treatments, but they exist. You can also try to work with a trainee at a private practice, like an extern or a postdoc or an intern. They might have a lower fee. And if they're a trainee, they're supervised by a licensed clinician. So you're still getting really high quality treatment. So I would definitely recommend that. I will say for DBT, one of the big arguments for it that's often given, which is true, is that it is a big investment short term because it typically involves individual therapy, group therapy once every week. It is meant to be short term and it does tend to keep people out of hospitalization. So, like if people who are struggling with suicidality and self harm who might end up in an inpatient unit, that's going to be a lot more expensive than doing outpatient therapy for, let's say, a year or 2 years or even 6 months. And so this may save you, hopefully will save you a lot of money in the long run, and that's what a lot of this is about is like short-term investment for the long term and really teaching you how to be your own therapist. It's not meant to be forever. So yes, it's important to find affordable options that you can continue with and be consistent with and to recognize that it's not supposed to be long term.
That's so interesting, and I think it's important to note not only will these practices help you to save money, but they'll also help your well-being so much down the line because you'll be able to learn new ways to cope with your anxiety or fear, which will help you to be just so much less anxious in the future. And anxiety can be so paralyzing sometimes and prevent you from going after opportunities that would really help you in the long term. And so if you can manage your anxiety and then go after these amazing opportunities, that'll be so beneficial to you. Therapy is worth investing in because of how evidence-based it is and how much it can help you in the future. What inspired you to pursue clinical psychology? And like, why did you start Mindwell New York City?
Good questions. So I was always interested in human behavior and why people do what they do. I was initially thinking I wanted to be a psychiatrist and go to medical school. And so I was pre med in college initially. And then that was very challenging. And I also realized that I wanted to learn more than just the chemistry, biology, and really understand human behavior and social science psychology. So I pivoted and then pursued a career in clinical psychology. I also had seen growing up a lot of people who are close to me really benefit from mental health services and support. So that really inspired me as well to pursue a degree in clinical psychology. And in terms of Mindwell, I really wanted to open a private practice that aligned with my values. And so I started Mindwell with two partners who had similar vision and we really wanted to create a warm and friendly community for people to feel comfortable going to therapy and just being in a therapeutic environment that also provided high quality care and evidence based treatments.
That's so meaningful because a lot of people are afraid to go to therapy and it can be scary to be in such like a vulnerable space. Are there any other resources that you might recommend for somebody who wants to learn more about CBT or DBT? Like, are there individual workbooks or books they can read, or where would you recommend going for more information?
Yeah, so there's so many out there. On our website at mindwellnyc.com, we have a lot of resources. I would say for teens, actually, one of my partners at Mindwell wrote a book called Feeling Better for Teens. It's a CBT workbook, and it's a great general workbook for anxiety and boosting self esteem and managing mood. For more emotion regulation, there's a workbook called Don't Let Your Emotions Run Your Life for teens. There's also a relaxation and stress reduction workbook for teens. And for adults, a more general workbook that I like is Mind Over Mood. That really helps you to work on changing how you think in order to change how you feel. And then there's the DBT solutions for emotional eating, if that's like more specifically what you're looking for. So there's a lot out there, but I would say those are some that I really like.
Wow. CBT and DBT are so amazing. They're so evidence backed and there's so many great resources. that provide you with super tangible ways of approaching things, because I know I'm somebody who likes something that's like, here are the steps of how you can tackle this specific thing. And with a lot of talk therapy, when you're talking about like your past, you can't really see a clear path forward, but CBT and DBT seem like such great solutions for people who really want those steps and a path to take. So, just one last question. So, if you had one piece of advice to give to your teenage self, the teenage self who was like stressed about the test that was coming up or like presenting and everything, what advice would you give to that teenage version of you?
That's a good question. I think I would say that it's going to be okay. Everything works out in some way, and there will be hard times and challenges, and you have the ability to cope with them and to get through them, and well, even when it's hard.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was so amazing to chat about CBT and DBT because I didn't really know a lot about it coming into this. I did a little bit of background research, but besides that, I didn't know a lot. And I feel like I've learned a lot about CBT and DBT from you, and I hope that listeners have learned a lot too. And if this is not something they'd heard about before, hopefully they'll look into it to see if it can help them. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Balancing Act. It was so interesting to finally learn a bit more about CBT and DBT and exposure therapy because I'd heard about them but had absolutely no clue what they were. So, this was such a great educational episode, and I hope you learned something. And so, here were my biggest takeaways from the episode. 1. CBT and DBT are evidence based therapies which work on tackling issues in the present moment through actively shifting your mindset when it comes to anxiety, challenging thoughts that you're having, or by going out there and facing your fears in real time. 2. Deep breathing is a tool that you can use to help with your anxiety or to conquer a phobia. But it's really by doing that thing that you're afraid of that you will begin to overcome the phobia. 3. Exposure therapy really helps to overcome phobias because your brain literally creates new associations to make things less scary, which I think is so cool. 4. CBT and DBT are not designed to be long term therapies, meaning that you won't be working with a therapist for a really long time. Instead, you'll be learning how to be your own therapist, which can help you to regulate your anxiety and phobias really well, even if you're not actively seeing a therapist, which can be such a great investment in terms of your well being in the long run. And then my two personal favorite skills that Dr. Skolnick shared in this episode were that one, when you're feeling anxious and you're thinking of the worst case scenario, you can also think of the best case scenario to help combat those anxious thoughts. And then the second was that, for body image, you can use exposure therapy and actually looking in the mirror in a different way to help cope with it, which I think is just so cool. If you want to learn more CBT or DBT skills, check out some of the other CBT or DBT episodes because I'm starting to realize how cool this therapy is. I will be recording some more episodes with Dr. Skolnick to bring you different skills for anxiety, depression, OCD, eating disorders, a whole long list of things with cool individual episodes so that you can learn skills for things that you may want to have extra skills to cope with. So I hope you'll stay tuned for those episodes as well. Thank you for listening to this episode of Balancing Act, Life and Struggles of a Teenage Girl. If this episode resonated with you, or if you know someone it could help, please feel free to share it with your loved ones or on social media. You can find us on Instagram at balancingact.podcast or on our website balancingact.life, which are both linked in the description. If you really want to support the podcast, leaving us a rating, hopefully a good one, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify would be invaluable. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, or if you want to suggest a topic or person for a future episode, please, please, please feel free to reach out to us through social media, our website, or email, which you can find on the website. Thanks again for taking the time to listen. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day, and remember, life's a balancing act, and sometimes you fall on your face, but you are not alone.